Korea, known for completely different things depending on which of the two you're thinking about. One takes pride in their military forces, and the other has a global influence in technology and pop culture. But have you ever wondered why Korea is divided into North and South? If you're curious, then you're in luck. We're talking about the Korean War, the causes, the chaos, and the consequences. Hey there. Welcome to our channel. This is Eventful Insights, back at it again for another deep dive into the past. Today, we have a very interesting push and pull piece of history for you in the form of the Korean War. As we start unraveling the pages, let's find out what happens when two completely different ideals clash in the battlefield. Before we get into it, we want to know where you get your knowledge about North and South Korea from. Social media, the news, television programs, in class, your history books. Let us know down in the comments. And with that, let's begin. From 1950 to 1953, the Korean War was a gigantic conflict between two opposing factions, resulting in the loss of lives for over 2.5 million people. What lasted for 3 devastating years forever changed the nation of Korea. The overall war got several countries involved, especially the members of the United Nations. It reached a point where the battles looked like a game of tug-of-war, with heavy weapons and aerial strikes. And even long after the chaos, the effects of this destructive event in history led to the still divided Korean nations we know today, the North and South. But its origins run deeper than just a feud between territories. Would you believe it if we tell you that some say that the Koreans did not even start this war? So, for us to better understand why all of that happened in the first place, we have to go back a few years to the aftermath of the Cold War. For more than 70 years, Korea has been split into North and South, a result of the Cold War rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States. Before this split, Korea was a single country, ruled by kings for many years. Japan took control of Korea after a war in 1905 and made it part of its territory 5 years later. Koreans didn't like being ruled by Japan, but they had to endure it for 35 years until the end of World War II. After the war, Korea was divided into 2 parts, and some say its citizens had no say in this decision, that it was made by the Soviet Union and the United States. Rewinding it back to August 1945, the supposed allies, the Soviet Union and the United States, divided control over Korea. From 1945 to 1948, the Soviet Army and its delegates set up a communist government in the northern part of Korea, above the 38th parallel. Meanwhile, the United States supported a military government in the south, below that line. The Americans thought this setup would only be temporary, but the Soviet actions terrified the people, making them flee to the south. This resulted in a lot of disagreement on how to bring Korea back together. So, in 1947, U.S. President Harry S. Truman asked the United Nations to take charge. In 1948, the United States wanted all Koreans to vote to decide what would happen to Korea. But the North didn't want to be part of it. So, the South made its own government in Seoul, led by the strong anti-communist Lee Syngman. The North did the same, with the former communist guerrilla Kim Il-sung becoming the leader in Pyongyang. By the fall of that year, fights started in different parts of South Korea, particularly below the 38th parallel line. These scrimmages escalated into a small-scale war that involved the newly formed Republic of Korea Army in the south and the Korean People's Army in the north, along with their border troops. The North even dispatched groups of fighters into the south to cause disturbances and distract the opposing army. In August of that same year, Lee Syngman became the president of the Republic of Korea. However, all these battles and conflicts resulted in significant loss of life, with about 8,000 South Korean security forces and at least 30,000 Koreans breathing their last breath. Tragically, not all the casualties were soldiers on the battlefield. Many innocent civilians were targeted by both sides, labeling them as rightists or Reds. This level of violence became common and ordinary, hindering the proper training of the South Korean army. The actual war has not even begun yet, but chaos already started to rise. But this is where things become really heated. In 1949, Kim Il-sung sought Joseph Stalin's approval to invade South Korea, but Stalin declined, fearing North Korea's lack of readiness and potential US involvement. Over the following year, North Korea boosted its military strength, modeling it after the Soviet Union's formidable army. China also contributed by allowing Korean soldiers to join North Korea's army, while the Soviets supplied them with weapons. By 1950, North Korea possessed superior weaponry compared to South Korea. After Kim's visit to Moscow in March, Stalin eventually approved the invasion in 1950. The war then started on June 25, 1950, when North Korean troops breached the 38th parallel, launching an invasion of South Korea. North Korean leader Kim Il-sung initiated the attack after securing assurances of support from Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. In January 1950, U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson's speech suggested that South Korea and Taiwan were beyond America's defense perimeter, hinting at possible U.S. non-intervention in a Korean conflict. Stalin's decision to back the invasion only came after he was convinced of the U.S.'s reluctance to interfere. If you're wondering how the entire invasion led by the North went down, here are the major details. Early in the morning on June 25th, North Korea attacked across the 38th parallel with an alarming number of artillery. The main attack was led by 53,000 soldiers of the Korean People's Army First Corps, and it went straight towards Seoul, crossing the Incheon River. It did not stop there because another group of 54,000 soldiers from the Second Corps attacked in two different directions. One towards Hongcheon through Chuncheon and Inje, and the other down the East Coast Road towards Gangneung. This day became a significant moment in South Korea's history, known as the 6-25 War. Even though they took Seoul, North Korea didn't achieve their goal of forcing the South to raise the white flag and quickly surrender, as well as their other aim of breaking their army apart. Instead, the South Korean forces made a defense line south of the Han River, and the South Korean army on the east coast retreated in good order. But despite their ability to stand their ground, in order for the South to stop from collapsing, they needed help from the U.S. Army. Initially, President Truman instructed General Douglas MacArthur to provide weapons to South Korea's army and to use airplanes to protect the Americans leaving the area. Truman believed that it would take too long if he sought a formal declaration of war from Congress, so instead of doing that, he turned to the United Nations asking for the same thing. With support from the United States, the UN initially called for an end to the invasion on June 25th, and then on June 27th, they appealed to UN member countries to assist South Korea's army. These resolutions were voted on by the UN Security Council, which could have been blocked by nations like the Soviet Union. But that wasn't the case. Because the Soviets were absent, they were upset about discussions within the UN about the admission of Communist China. In the United States, most people and Congress were in favor of joining the battle without any significant objections. After displaying that the Truman government wanted to be involved, it realized that it did not have enough soldiers to fight back against the invasion. Even with MacArthur having 3 divisions from Japan, the U.S. soldiers kept falling short and losing. For about 2 months, from Pusan to Daegu, American soldiers fought and many died while some ran away. They didn't have enough weapons or soldiers, and their leaders were no longer sure of what to do. And it wasn't just the soldiers suffering from all this chaos. Many people were leaving their homes, and this made it easier for enemy troops to sneak in. Because of this, there were terrible attacks on Korean people. For a long time, South Korean and American officials said the North Koreans were responsible for the killing of thousands of people at Daejeon, when in reality, this war crime was actually done by South Korean paramilitary forces. At the end of July, American soldiers shot at refugees near a railroad bridge at Syngman Rhee, killing hundreds. It wasn't until the beginning of August that the United Nations Command, or the UNC, led by MacArthur's forces, began to slow down the advancing North Koreans. Lieutenant General Walton H. Walker and Major General Chung Il-kwan, who were in charge of the South Korean army, started fighting back more effectively. Here's how they did it. They received supplies from the port of Pusan, where Korean and Japanese workers provided valuable assistance. General Walker deployed tanks, rocket launchers, artillery, and planes to stop the North Koreans from advancing. The 5th Air Force used a combination of old and new aircraft to attack the North Korean army. U.S. Marines stationed on ships were prepared to offer assistance wherever needed, while U.S. Navy ships provided support with their heavy weaponry. Additional American and British soldiers arrived to lend a hand, and the South Korean army also saw an increase in its numbers, including the addition of student volunteers and draftees. Afraid that the United Nations Command would keep growing stronger until September, the commander of the Korean People's Army, General Kim Chek, ordered an attack on the Naktung River Daegu-Yeongdeok line. This line later became known as the Pusan perimeter. They tried to surround Daegu and also attacked Masan and Puang, but they did not succeed. In the Battle of Tabudong, from August 18 to 26, South Korean and American soldiers stopped the main North Korean attack toward Daegu. By September 12th, the North Korean army had been pushed back to the west of the Naktung River, away from Daegu and Puang, and their tank forces were destroyed. Then, the 10th Corps, consisting of the 1st Marine Division and 2 Army divisions, suddenly appeared at Incheon, changing the entire strategic sphere of the war. You probably didn't think there were so many countries and different factions involved, did you? So far, what's been the most shocking part about the Korean War to you? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. Also, if you're invested in all things history, check out our channel, and you'll probably find something that will pique your interest. Now let's get back into the thick of it. MacArthur began planning an operation as early as July, believing that a strategic landing deep within enemy lines would turn the tide of the war. He entrusted Major General Edward M. Almond, MacArthur's Chief of Staff, to lead the infantry, marine, and support troops responsible for such an important mission. After an aerial bombing on September 14th, the Marines attacked Wolmido Island the next day and captured Incheon later that afternoon, despite fierce resistance from North Korean soldiers. Supported by South Korean and American forces, they reached Seoul by September 25th. MacArthur and Lee Syngman then went into the damaged Capitol building and said South Korea was finally free. In August and September, the North Korean army started to fall apart, with around 13,000 becoming prisoners and 50,000 getting hurt or killed. Even with these tragedies, about 25,000 of their top soldiers headed to the mountains and returned home together, while another 10,000 stayed in South Korea and fought as partisans. As they retreated north, they took many South Koreans as captives and forced them into slavery, while also killing many others. Over 1,500 people, including civilians and American and South Korean captives, were killed in Daejeon, possibly in retaliation for earlier acts of cruelty done by South Korean soldiers. On the other hand, the South Korean army and police were also extremely harsh toward anyone they suspected of being a communist, and American planes bombed areas without much precision. As a result, the last 2 weeks of September were filled with numerous horrific acts of violence by both parties, making it look like peace would never be an option between the two. In September, particularly on the 27th, the Joint Chiefs gave MacArthur the green light to advance north of the 38th parallel, but he had to be careful in case Russia or China got involved. Another thing we have to understand is that the UN aimed to occupy the entirety of North Korea and dismantle their army to rebuild Korea as a unified nation. So on October 1st, South Korean troops crossed the parallel, followed by American troops on October 7th. South Korean soldiers swiftly moved up the east coast toward Wonsan, while American soldiers seized Pyongyang on the 19th. While all of this was happening, Kim Il-sung's government, along with some North Korean soldiers, retreated to Kanghae in the mountains. Other soldiers who were being helped by Soviet advisors headed northwest toward the Chinese border. Although the UNC believed that the North Korean soldiers had lost their will to fight, they were actually biding their time, waiting for help. As it's probably very evident by now, the Korean War has a lot of moving parts, especially with the countries involved with North or South. So when Kim Il-sung reached out to Chinese Communist Party Chairman Mao Zedong for help in a letter, because the UNC soldiers advanced beyond the 38th parallel, another nation was set to be heavily involved in the war. The chairman was willing to provide assistance, but first he needed assurance that the Soviet Union would protect China's air bases and hydroelectric plants. Stalin agreed to this and even went beyond that by offering new weapons and factories to produce them. After lengthy discussions, Mao instructed the Chinese People's Volunteers Force to enter Korea. From October 25 to November 6, 1950, the Chinese First Offensive aimed to test how well the US and South Korean armies fought and to slow their progress down. In the Battle of Incheon, Unsan, the Chinese defeated 7 Korean and US regiments, including the only Korean regiment that reached the Yalu River, trapping them in the cold hills near Chosin. Although the Chinese suffered 10,000 casualties, they learned effective tactics against UNC forces. This offensive caught the 8th Army off guard, resulting in almost 8,000 casualties, forcing them to retreat to the south bank of the Chongchon River and strengthen their defenses because of the harsh winter conditions and lack of supplies. Things took a serious turn when the UNC spotted MiG-15 jets in North Korea. These fighter jets were flown by Soviet pilots pretending to be Chinese or Korean, stopping most daytime raids. To counter this, the US sent F-86 Sabre jets to combat them, sparking a long battle for air control that lasted over 2 years. Despite US efforts, the Chinese kept preparing for a big attack, aiming to trick American and South Korean forces into leaving their safe spots to surround them with 420,000 soldiers. From November 25 to December 14th, the Chinese pushed them back into South Korea, isolating one group of soldiers from their allies, struggling as they fought back. Meanwhile, the Chinese attacked the Marines near the Chosin Reservoir, but the Marines made it to safety at the port of Hungnam on December 11th, despite the severe weather. In the midst of this chaos, MacArthur, Walker, and Almond discussed setting up safe areas in North Korea, but Walker, fed up with MacArthur's meddling, led his troops southward. By December 6th, the 8th Army had left gear behind and retreated to Seoul. Although Walker's choice saved his army, it meant the UNC had to work hard to regain lost ground. Sadly, Walker died in a car crash near Seoul on December 23rd, and Lieutenant General Matthew B. Ridgway took over. Now, here's where things further intensify with some serious back and forth. Once Mao Zedong saw how easily the Chinese pushed the UNC out of North Korea, he decided he wanted more. He told the Chinese army to unify all of Korea and kick the Americans and their allies off the peninsula. From December 31st, 1950 to January 5th, 1951, Mao was happy when the Chinese Third Offensive recaptured Seoul. The Chinese mainly targeted the struggling Republic of Korea army divisions. So Ridgway had to rely on his US divisions and troops from other UN countries. With this multinational force, Ridgway fought back to the Han River Valley in January 1951. On February 11, 1951, the Chinese launched their fourth offensive after receiving more troops from North Korea. They hit unprepared South Korean divisions, causing the UNC to lose ground. But despite this, the 8th Army fought back, crossing the 38th parallel after 2 months. Then General Peng Dehuai started the 5th offensive with 11 Chinese armies and 2 North Korean corps. This happened just when Truman decided MacArthur was too independent, so he fired him on April 11th and replaced him with Ridgway, while Lieutenant General James A. Van Fleet took over the 8th Army. Before Van Fleet could even teach anything to his troops, the Chinese attacked once again. The soldiers struggled, and U.S. divisions had to protect their sides until Van Fleet could bring in more troops to stop the Chinese on April 28th. Mao didn't believe Peng's report that the Chinese People's Volunteers Force was losing, so he ordered another phase of the offensive on May 16th. But once again, Allied air power and heavy artillery helped the UNC resist, and they crossed the 38th parallel, chasing the weakened Chinese force. By June 1951, the Korean War reached a critical stage. Despite suffering around 500,000 casualties since November, the Chinese North Korean armies had grown to 1,200,000 soldiers. The United Nations Command had also faced losses, with over 100,000 casualties since the Chinese intervention. By May 1951, U.S. ground troops numbered 256,000, the Republic of Korea Army 500,000, and other Allied troops 28,000. As the numbers rose, it made leaders on both sides realize that peace couldn't be achieved through military victory without unacceptable costs. President Truman and the UN were no longer eager for anything more than returning to how things were before the war, and were open to the idea of a negotiated settlement. On May 17, 1951, the U.S. National Security Council adopted a new policy. It committed the United States to support a unified democratic Korea, but not necessarily through military means or overthrowing Kim Il-sung. After private talks between US and Soviet diplomats, the Soviet Union said it wouldn't stop a peaceful end to the Korean War. Then rightfully, Truman's administration had already informed Ridgway about the possibility of peace talks. On June 30th, Ridgway publicly announced his readiness to participate in discussions to stop the conflict. Then on July 2nd, the Chinese and North Koreans agreed to engage in talks, but insisted on holding them in Kaesong, an old Korean capital now controlled by the Communists. This marked a shift in the war dynamics, where negotiations and military maneuvers were seen as potential paths to end the hostilities. By early 1951, the Chinese offensive had slowed, and under the leadership of Ridgway, the UNC reclaimed Seoul and regrouped near the 38th parallel. From July 8, 1951 onward, the battle lines remained relatively the same, leading to a stalemate. The Truman administration abandoned the goal of reunifying Korea and instead focused on smaller objectives to prevent a broader conflict involving China and the Soviet Union. So after 13 months of fighting, both sides initiated discussions to end the conflict, but it dragged on for over 2 years. Following Stalin's death in March 1953, the new leadership in Moscow expedited negotiations, culminating in a ceasefire agreement signed on July 27, 1953. This is how the truce came to be. On December 2, 1952, President-elect Dwight D. Eisenhower visited Korea, as promised during his election campaign. After visiting with troops, commanders, and South Korean leaders to gather updates on the war, Eisenhower decided that staying in one area and taking casualties without making any progress was not an option. He believed that launching small-scale strikes on little hills would not finish the dispute. Eisenhower intended to use a combination of talking and showing military strength to end the war in Korea. With that goal in mind, on July 27, 1953, 7 months into his administration, an armistice was reached, bringing the main fighting to a conclusion and keeping Korea split along the 38th parallel, as it had been since the end of World War II. After the Korean War, the nation stayed split into North and South, like two separate worlds. Families got torn apart by the fighting, stuck on opposite sides with no way to talk or see each other, not knowing when or if they will ever get to. The war hit civilians drastically, with millions hurt, missing or worse. Factories and buildings were demolished, leaving Korea's industry in ruins. The North struggled, sinking into poverty while the South raced ahead, building up its economy. American soldiers stuck around in South Korea, which was a thorn in China's side and made things tense between them and the US. Today, both North and South Korea are prospering in their own ways, but there is still tension between them. They've been separated since the Korean War ended in 1953 with an armistice. Technically, they're still at war, but both sides hope to reunite one day. However, the current leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, has different ideas. In December 2023, he changed a long-standing policy about unifying with South Korea in the future. He now wants to be prepared to take control of South Korea if needed. North Korea's military strength could make this possible, he said. South Korea still wants unification, but its president, Yoon Suk-yeol, is ready to react to any trouble from North Korea and is getting the military ready. Is history doomed to repeat itself? And there you have it, from a territory that was forced to split into two, resulting in a back and forth of severe blows, to an agreed ceasefire. After educating yourself with this video, do you think there's any way for the North and South to finally be unified? Let us know what you think in the comments. Thanks for making it to the end of the video. While you're still here, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Ring that notification bell while you're at it. And we hope to see you soon in our next upload. Thanks for watching.